Good morning. Today's lesson is 2.5. Today we'll be focusing on model fraction division. Our essential question, how can you use a model to show division of fractions? Connect. There are two types of division problems. In one type, you find how many or how much in each group. And in another, you find how many groups. Let's investigate. The materials we're using today are the fraction strips. A class is working on a community project to clear a path near the lake. They are working in teams on sections of the path. 4 students clear the section that is 2/3 mile long. If each student clears an equal part, what is the fraction of the mile that each will clear? So remember, we have 4 students and we're dividing that into 2/3. So if we're going to divide 2/3 by the 4 students, you can use the fraction strips to model the division and draw your model. So here's a whole number just to kind of give you a comparison. And if I put the 2/3 underneath of it, I need to take these 2/3 and I need to break them into 4 parts. So what are you trying to find? Well, I'm trying to find how much is in each group of 2/3 if it's shared among the 4 groups. So I have to think to myself, what can I break these apart? What fraction strips are going to fit equally in 4 groups under here? Because we need this to fit equally into 4 groups. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, I know that 1/6 and 1/6 will equal that 1/3, because 2/6 is 1/3. And so if I break these equally into 1/6 strips, I should be able to figure that out. So 2/3 divided by 4 is 1/6. So each student is going to clear 1/6 of the mile. Another team clears a section of the path that is 3/4 of a mile long. If each student clears 1/8 of a mile, how many students are on the team? So I'm going to divide 3/4 by 1/8. And I'm going to use the fraction strips to model and draw my model. So what are we trying to find here? Well, here we're trying to find how many groups of 1/8 are in 3/4. So I need to take these quarters, right? I have 3/4, and I need to break them up into 8 groups. So I need to break them up into 8 groups. So in order to break them up into 8 groups, I'm going to use the 8 tiles, the 1/8 tile, right? Because that's what's going to fit equally among these 3. 1/4 is, and I need 8 of them, so 8 of the 1/8. So 3/4 divided by 1/8, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 groups. So there are 6 students on the team. Use models. Explain how the model in problem A shows a related multiplication fact. Well, the model shows that 4 groups of 1/6 are equal to 2/3, or 4 times 1/6 equals 2/3. So we did this in our last lesson yesterday. So if we had 4 times 1/6, remember I put my 1 under here, I can cross multiply is easy. If I take that, 4 or 2 goes into 4 2 times, 2 goes into 6 3 times, and then I multiply straight across, and I get 2/3, okay? So that's my model that is going to show the related multiplication fact. Problem 2, analyze. Suppose a whole number is divided by a fraction between 0 and 1. Is the quotient greater than or less than the dividend? Explain and give an example. Well, here's my example. It is going to be greater than, and here's why. Since we are finding how many groups of a number is less than 1, there are in a given whole number, then there are going to be more groups than there is a whole number. For example, 4 divided by 1/2 equals 8. It means that there's going to be 8 groups of 1/2 in 4. Let's make a connection. You can draw a model to help you solve a fraction division problem. Jessica is making a recipe that calls for 3/4 cup of flour. Suppose she only has a 1/2 cup size measuring scoop. How many 1/2 cup scoops of flour does she need? Well, let me move this up. step 1. So we're dividing 3/4 by a half. So 3/4 divided by a half. Step 1, draw a model that represents the total amount of flour. So think, divide a whole number into fourths. Okay? Or fourths. Because right there we're dividing it into fourths, right? So Jessica is going to need 3/4 cups, right? Because we're dividing it into fourths. So we have 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. But she's only using 3/4 of the fourths. So I'm just going to kind of color these in. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. It's much easier when you have your fraction tiles in front of you. Step 2 says, draw a fraction parts that represents the scoop of flours. So what are we trying to find out? We're trying to find out how many groups of 1/2 are in 3/4. So we know how many groups of a half are in 3/4. So there's my 3/4. So I'm going to go ahead and put my halves, and you have your own fraction tiles. Let me do this in a different color. Here's 1/2, 1/2, and here's another half, right? Because this should equal, and if I had my whole bar tile, this would be 1 whole. So if I have my half and I have my other half, I only want to know how much is in 1/2. So I'm looking strictly at this. I'm going to color it. We're looking at this half, right? And I have 1/4, 2/4, and 3/4. And I want to know how many halves are in those. So it kind of comes right there, right? So there is one full group of a half. Do you see my one full group of a half? And then I have a half group of a half, right? Because it goes to right here. And then I have 1/2 of a group of a half. So there's going to be 1.5 groups of 1/2 and 3/4. So 3/4 divided by 1/2 is going to be 1 1/2. So Jessica will need 1 1/2 scoops of flour. What if Jessica's recipe called for 1/4 cup of flour? How many half scoops of flour does she need? Well, if it's just 1/4, so that's the 1/4, right? She's just going to need a half. All right, let's do 1 together in the share and show. So looking at number 1, we have 1/2 divided by 3. So you're going to use your fraction tiles. Here's my 1/2, and I need to divide it into 3 equal parts. So you need to figure out which fraction is going to fit under that. If you've got your fraction tiles in front of you, you'll discover that 1/6 fits perfectly 3 of them underneath the 1/2. So now we have our 1/2 divided by 3 is going to be 1/6. Again, you may work with a partner, a group, or myself. I'll be on the carpet, and good luck.